Content warning: this episode contains details of violence, assault, and references to sexual assault. Please take care of yourself whilst listening to this episode. Mabuhay! Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast with me, Christine, your host. Every 2 weeks, I bring you stories of infamous crimes committed in the Philippines, the country of my mother, and where I grew up for most of my life. As a true crime podcast fan, I always wondered what lay beyond the true crime stories from North America and Europe. As it turned out, I would myself quench that podcast thirst by starting my own podcast. I hope you enjoy this ride along with me. Our first episode is about the beautiful Maggie dela Riva. I was in grade school in the Philippines when I first heard of Maggie dela Riva. A movie had just come out that was supposed to be based on a horrible crime that was perpetrated on this woman who was considered as, for all intents and purposes, the Filipino Audrey Hepburn. I think as a young girl, I had always been a true crime fan because I told my mother that whatever this movie was, whose trailer was being shown over and over again during commercial breaks on television, I wanted to see it. My mother was, of course, horrified. She knew the story of Maggie dela Riva. She knew that however this movie was made, it was not appropriate for a 10-year-old. But I nevertheless learned what the movie was about in school. Some older schoolmates of mine decided to show off their knowledge and told us what had happened to Miss dela Riva in a way only a 12 and 13-year-old could. And needless to say, I went home horrified and maybe a bit traumatized as well. I could not imagine, even as a 10-year-old, being forced to go through something as horrible as a sexual assault by one person. And I mean, perpetrated by one person, let alone four. And that was Maggie's fate one early June morning. Maggie dela Riva's nightmare started in the early hours of June 26, 1967. Maggie and her personal assistant, Helen Calderon, were driving home after a hard day's work at the ABS-CBN studios, a TV network. Her workplace was in Pasay, but she lived in Quezon City, so she needed to drive at least 16 kilometers, but she was not worried. The humid monsoon air had cooled down now, and there was no trace of that infamous Manila traffic at 4:30 in the morning. She was almost at home when her sleepy and slumbersome thoughts were suddenly rattled awake by a Pontiac convertible car that came close to bumping her off the road. What the hell, she probably thought. Despite being tired, Maggie was very alert, and she was alert enough to hit her brakes to avoid colliding into this rogue car. After hitting the brakes, she stepped on the gas and swerved her Bantam car to the left, bringing her and Helen right in front of her house's gate. Maggie probably thought she had seen the last of the rogue car, but she would be wrong. The driver of the rogue car accelerated towards her direction, risking a near collision with Maggie's car again. "Ano ba?" Maggie said. "What's going on?" Hoping that this car would just drive off and leave her alone, Maggie was stunned to see the driver get out of his car and march towards her. Maggie could see 3 more people in the car. This is weird, she probably thought. This confusion turned into fear really quickly whilst looking at the aggressive and determined steps of the driver who was heading swiftly into her direction. She started tooting her horn to make known her frustration, but also because she was afraid. But alas, she forgot. She forgot to lock her doors. The rogue driver, later to be identified as Basilio Pineda Jr., yanked Maggie's car door open and grabbed her left arm. She tried desperately to hold on to her steering wheel, screaming, looking at her personal assistant, who then also started screaming. But it was chaos. Maggie's strength was no match against Pineda's. He dragged her out of the car whilst Helen acted quickly and jumped out of her passenger seat. She ran towards Maggie and grabbed her right arm, trying to free her from Pineda's grip, but Helen failed. Helen could only watch in horror as the three remaining passengers in the convertible car got out and helped Pineda force Maggie into the convertible's back seat. One was holding her neck, whilst the two others were holding her arms and legs. It did not take long for the four men to overpower Maggie completely. Pineda then jumped back into the driver's seat and sped away from a horrified Helen. Maggie could not imagine the horror that the four strangers had planned for her. Instead, she pleaded with them, pleaded to release her. But they made fun of her instead. They responded with jeers, abusive and disrespectful language, essentially telling her that they would finish her, threatening to throw acid at her face if she did not stop talking. So she stopped. The two men sat with Maggie in the back seat, started touching her. She was trapped then and there. One of the men, called Jaime Gomez Jose, a popular band leader, son of a prominent doctor and a known gang member who would harass budding celebrities in the Philippines, started to put his arms around Maggie and forced a kiss on her. The other man beside her, Edgardo Aquino Payumo, a second-year journalism student and a lawyer's son, started touching her thighs and lifted her skirt. Maggie fought their advances. She continued pleading with them, begging them to let her go, telling them that she was the sole breadwinner for the family and that her mother was at home all alone, probably worried sick about her daughter. But the men would not listen. They continued to touch her. At some point, they made fun of her for not having a father. This was a piece of public information that was known about Maggie because she was a celebrity in the Philippines. According to Maggie's abductors, because she didn't have a father, no one would be able to exact revenge on them no matter what they did to Maggie. How helpless she must have felt. In her heart, she hoped to get out of this hell, but her mind kind of knew the futility of her pleas. So she fell silent. She closed her eyes for a few seconds and made the sign of the cross. Maggie, like a lot of Filipinos, is Catholic. So she prayed. She tried to find some inner peace, something that would ground her in this uncertain and scary situation. But even that was denied to her. The men in the car became angry at this display of religion. They cursed angrily at Maggie, and she was left with nothing but silent tears and an indescribable fear for her life. After what seemed like an eternity in that car, Pineda drove the car into a cul-de-sac. It seemed to Maggie like Pineda did not know that this was going to be a cul-de-sac. So, Pineda backed up and turned around to drive to Araneta Avenue, only to proceed to Edsa Avenue. By this time, Maggie was already around 10 kilometers away from her home. Pineda then drove a few more minutes and arrived in Makati and then into Pasay City. Payumo then took a handkerchief from his pocket and, with Jose's help, blindfolded Maggie. She was threatened again by the men. It was made clear to her that if she at any point screamed or called any attention to their group, she would be stabbed or shot. The men had knives and a Thompson with them. Maggie knew about this, and they said that they were ready to use both weapons on Maggie should she try to draw attention to them. A blindfolded Maggie was led out of the car and into the second floor of the Swanky Hotel. One of the men, she was not sure who, made her sit on a bed. Maggie uttered a silent prayer, not wanting to further anger her abductors with this display of religion. And then somebody removed her blindfold. It may have been the fourth man in the group called Rogelio Cañal Sevilla. Maggie squinted for a few seconds after the blindfold was removed. She was trying to figure out really quickly where she was, but there was no time for that. Pineda and Payumo were standing right in front of her, looking at her, leering. Jose and Sevilla were sat on her left and right side. Suddenly, a claustrophobic feeling overcame her. Before she could think of any plan to escape or to plead with her captors again, Pineda barked at her, "Magburles ka para sa amin." In English, that meant striptease for us, dance for us naked. Maggie felt her heart race. She's being told to disrobe and dance for these monsters. The other three approved of Pineda's orders and even suggested to dim the lights, but that idea was quickly abandoned because, in the end, all four men wanted to see her humiliate herself by dancing in front of them, disrobing in front of them, by exposing herself to them. She knew there was no escape at this point. She thought of her mother, her family, who must be wondering where she was right now. She was thinking of Helen. Poor Helen. What was Maggie supposed to do? Not following Pineda's orders might mean her death, so she obliged. She started to disrobe very slowly. And because she decided to do this very slowly, she was cursed by her assailants for being too slow. She was taking too long for their taste, apparently. So they threatened her again with their gun and with the acid. They started pushing her around. One of her assailants, she did not know who exactly, unzipped her dress. Another one unhooked her bra. Maggie felt violated. Why was this happening to her? Why her? She held on to the front of her dress for as long as possible, trying with all her might to prevent herself from becoming naked, but they overpowered her. Her assailants seemed manic. They pulled down her dress with a kind of remorselessness that no human should be able to demonstrate. Now, at this point of the story, I could tell you everything, all the details of what had happened to Maggie exactly, but I refused to do so because what Maggie went through was truly horrendous. Maggie endured pain, violence, humiliation, terror. This should be enough for listeners to know. However, if you insist on knowing the details, then feel free to click through my references. There is a court document that details exactly what had happened to Maggie, but please consider this as your trigger warning. After all of her assailants horrendously violated Maggie, she got her clothes back and was ordered to get dressed. She was told to wash her face and fix her hair to make it appear as if nothing happened. At this point, I can imagine that Maggie just felt pretty much empty. She probably did not fear death anymore. What these monsters did to her was a fate worse than death. She followed their orders almost like an automaton. Maggie was told to tell her mother a lie as to where she was and what had happened to her. She should tell her mother that she was picked up by men who thought she was a prostitute but was quickly released when the men realized she was a movie actress. They threatened her. Like any abuser, they tried to convince her that if she reported them to the police, they would simply post bail. After all, they were rich. They will make sure also to find her and pour acid on her face to disfigure her. Deep inside, Maggie knew that they meant what they said, that they were capable of doing these things to her as an act of revenge. So Maggie kept quiet. She felt like she had become impure. In a predominantly Christian Asian country, she knew that she would not be viewed favorably. Where could she turn? She was lost in her thoughts when one of the men aggressively blindfolded her again. She was led out of the hotel room and down to the car. She stumbled over and over again, losing balance, feeling exhausted, and had to be carried into the car ultimately. When they were in the car, Maggie's head was held down to Jose's lap to ensure that no one saw her whilst they were driving. Maggie kept quiet. Her fate was still unknown at this point. She listened as her assailants discussed where to drop her off. Will they drop her off alive or dead? Maggie thought. Her assailants decided to drop her off near her workplace to make it look like, well, she had just finished work. When they arrived there, they hailed a cab, put Maggie in the cab, and issued one last warning to her. They said to never inform the authorities about what had happened. At this point, Maggie could not stand to listen to these monsters anymore. A sort of rage built up inside of her. She told herself that she just needed the door of her cab to close, and then she would be in safety. Finally, one of the men closed the door and the cab drove off. It was 6 a.m. at this point, and Maggie finally broke down in tears. It was like a dam had been opened. She could not stop. She asked her driver, "Are they following us?" The driver, seemingly confused by this question, said no. Maggie felt a little relief that she was finally physically separated from her abductors. It took another half an hour to reach her house, and when she did, she rushed into her home to see her mother there. She noticed that there were other people there too, but she did not really care to know who they were. She ran into her mother's arms and asked if she could talk to her in private. When they were alone, she could not hold it back any longer and told her mother everything that had happened to her. Now, you have to remember that back in the day, before we knew the importance of DNA and trace evidence collection, not a lot of value was put into preserving a survivor's clothing or documenting their presentation. So, Maggie's mom, being her mom, took her daughter upstairs to run her a bath and to make sure that she douched. Her mother's concern at this point was pregnancy. She did not want Maggie to get pregnant. It was the best thing her mother could come up with at that point, being confronted by this horrible reality facing her daughter and her family at that very moment. After her bath, Maggie learned that the unfamiliar people at her home were actually police officers who responded to the report of Maggie's abduction. As expected, they wanted to talk to Maggie as soon as possible, but Maggie's brother-in-law asked the police officers to give her some time to recover, as much as the circumstances would allow, really, and to decide whether she indeed wanted to be interviewed and to speak up about her tragic experience. Now, you have to remember that at this point, Maggie only told her mother about the sexual assault, but her brother-in-law, Helen, the police officers, they did not know about the rape. They only knew about the abduction. So, about 48 hours after her night marriage ordeal, Maggie and her family finally decided that the authorities needed to be informed about what happened to her. The family, along with Maggie's lawyer, went to the Quezon City Police Department. Maggie relayed the events of June 26th and gave detailed descriptions of her assailants. Maggie submitted herself to a medical examination afterwards. Now, back in the day, the medical legal community did not really have the sense to realize or discern that a medical examination of a female sexual assault survivor should most probably be conducted by a female professional. So, as a result of that, Maggie was examined by a male doctor. I cannot imagine the kind of re-traumatizing that took place whilst this was happening, but Maggie got through it. She was determined to get justice. Over the course of that same day and evening, Jaime Jose was apprehended and was formally identified by Maggie at the police headquarters. Jose proceeded to name his fellow assailants and had sworn in document that the idea of abducting and assaulting Maggie was the idea of Basilia Pineda Jr. Not too long after, the other 3 assailants were apprehended and brought to the authorities. Pineda and Cañal were apprehended on July 1st, and Aquino was caught on July 5th, 1967. It did not take a lot to have most of the assailants admit to the police that they have indeed abducted Maggie. However, Pineda and Aquino had the audacity to make it seem as if Maggie consented to sexual intercourse with them at the hotel. Now, it's not surprising to me that there was a trial pretty much right after the 4 men were arrested. When the trial began, it was horrifying to listen to the medical examiner's evidence about how battered Maggie's body was. Dr. Brion stated that Maggie suffered from multiple contusions and bruises on her chest, shoulders, arms, forearms, fingers, thighs, knees, and legs. Needless to say, Maggie suffered from genital injuries as well. She also suffered from tenderness around her neck and abdominal wall, likely to have been sustained from being beaten by a closed fist. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, 3 of the assailants pleaded not guilty, whilst Pineda pleaded guilty. What was beyond comprehension at the time of the trial was the narrative that was given by the 3 assailants who pleaded not guilty. Jose, Aquino, and Cañal essentially testified that all they wanted to do with Maggie was to scare her after she allegedly sped past them. They took offense when they realized that this speedy driver was indeed a woman. That's toxic masculinity for you, I guess. They abducted her and drove her around to punish her, essentially for offending them. Maggie allegedly begged for her life and asked her assailants if they had sisters or mothers in an attempt to probably make them remorseful for abducting her. As they were turning around to drop her off, Pineda allegedly changed his mind and told Maggie to striptease for them in exchange for 1,000 pesos. Maggie allegedly reacted incredulously and offended, but eventually consented as long as the whole thing did not take long. It was then that the whole group drove over to the Swanky Hotel. The 3 assailants testified that upon arrival at the hotel, Maggie asked for a handkerchief in order to blindfold herself. Allegedly, upon arriving in the room, she stripped. Jose and Aquino stripped down to their underwear, while Pineda and Cañal stripped completely. Allegedly, Maggie started the quote-unquote show and walked around the room 4 to 5 times, with the show lasting around 10 minutes. The 3 assailants would have the court believe that after 10 minutes, all the men simply got dressed up again, as well as Maggie, who later on gave them the idea as to where she could be dropped off. In the hotel, Maggie allegedly received 100 pesos, with the promise that the balance of 900 would then be given later to her. After the quote-unquote show, Pineda allegedly noticed that he lacked the funds to pay off Maggie in full, and instead proposed to visit some relatives nearby who could help him with the outstanding balance. What a story. Not surprisingly, the defense's fury of the case caused quite the outrage. The court transcript says, and I quote, "The striptease act for free story on which the defense theory is anchored defies one's credulity and reason." End of quote. The court called this theory an utter inverisimilitude. The court further called this story a last-ditch effort to save the day. The theory had so many holes, did not make any sense at all, and could not explain the injuries that Maggie suffered, among so many other things. The defense did try to explain the injuries, badly, if I may say so. In their theory, before the striptease started, both Pineda and Maggie were allegedly alone in the hotel room, thereby insinuating that maybe the two had sexual intercourse, or that maybe Pineda attacked Maggie in such a short amount of time before the others rejoined and watched the alleged striptease. This simply did not add up for the court. What I found really forward thinking in the court transcript, especially from a Filipino court in the late 60s, is the following statement by the judge, who could not simply believe that Maggie would just cry rape for no reason other than the truth. This is the quote. "A woman does not easily trump up rape charges, for she has much more to lose in the notoriety the case will reap her honor, and that of her family, than in the redress she demands." The court then continued, and this is the quote again. "Besides, it should be borne in mind that in the most detestable crime of rape, in which a man is at his worst, the testimony of the offended party most often is the only available to prove directly its commission, and that corroboration by other eyewitnesses would in certain cases place a serious doubt as to the probability of its commission. So trial courts of justice are most often placed in a position of having to accept such uncorroborated testimony if the same is in regards conclusive, logical, and probable." The court was confident that the line of defense had absolutely no leg to stand on. The rape was deemed to have likely been committed by all four assailants and not just Pineda, despite the contention that there was an absence of semen and therefore no rape. The contention was deemed untenable. The medical examiner testified earlier in the trial that semen would not be present after 3 days, and especially if the survivor had douched herself. Maggie's medical examination took place 4 days after the rape. I do not want to discuss the medical take on the assault, as again, this can be triggering for some listeners. But again, I would invite those who are interested to look at the court document that I have linked in the show notes. Now, the assailant's defense lawyers tried their very best in all avenues possible. As an example, Jose and Cañal sought to exclude their police statements, claiming that the statements were made under duress, but this was easily discredited. They also complained about the publicity that the case obtained and how this could affect their constitutional right to a fair hearing. This was also quickly shot down. In the end, all four were found guilty and were eventually sentenced to death. I highly recommend the Supreme Court document I have linked in the show notes if you're a bit of a law geek like me. The document towards the end discusses the finer details of sentencing, the possible futility of multiple death sentences on one person, and other legal questions that the Filipino judiciary sought to resolve and adjudicate on. After Pineda, Aquino, Jose, and Cañal were sentenced to death, it took another 4 years to actually execute them. In a sad, or rather infuriating twist of events, Cañal died of an overdose in prison before his execution date. Pineda, Aquino, and Jose were all executed by electric chair on May 1st, 1972. Maggie dela Riva's case brought the issue of rape to the forefront of Filipino consciousness. But as in all modern societies of the world, Filipinos still struggle with the same issues that we see here in the West when rape is a topic of discussion. We have the usual suspects, really: victim blaming, victim protection, fear of reporting rape, sentencing, privacy rights, and sexual education, including information on consent, are just some of the hot button topics that are being debated on when rape is being discussed. Not long after the Maggie dela Riva case, capital punishment was abolished in the Philippines. It was reinstated and abolished again, only to be reinstated during the Duterte administration. Now, you have to understand that at the moment, rape is not considered a capital offense. And this has deeply angered a lot of people. One of them would be Maggie. Now, Maggie, since her ordeal in 1967, continued with her acting career, but she made it a point to avoid interviews, to avoid giving interviews as much as possible. So, in a rare moment in 2017, Maggie dela Riva allowed someone to interview her. In the interview, she expressed her frustration about rape not being considered as a capital offense. Now, this stance might be polarizing. In fact, the death penalty, capital punishment, is a polarizing issue. I myself am against it, but I understand Maggie's advocacy in this regard, and I respect her advocacy. I will not seek to debate her or change her mind. She has seen the ugliest part of humanity that fateful June day in 1967, and she managed to stand tall to face her assailants all throughout the trial and the appeals. Now, in the beginning of this podcast, I did say that the assailants were sons of prominent figures in Filipino society, or at least were rich. So she was also fighting that. And she was an actress from a humble background who was thrown into the harshest of spotlights, fighting that kind of power and a whole system with little to no support from the public. So, who am I to change her mind on capital punishment when she truly thinks this is the only way to deter potential rapists and to achieve justice for people like her who were victimized by rapists? Maggie continues to speak out against rape to this very day. Now, in an interview, and I'm not sure if this is the same interview that I was just talking about or a different one, someone asked her about what happened to her in 1967, and she had this to say. When that misfortune happened to me, I realized that although my body was raped, my true self was never defiled, and that there's another person in me that's beautiful, strong, and true. The old Maggie has faded away. I looked at my experience as something that happened to someone else who is no longer the person that I am today. And with those words from Maggie, I would like to end this very first podcast episode of mine. I thank you very much for listening, and I would like to invite you to check out my social media accounts for additional content on the cases that I will be covering here, including this case that I've already covered. At the moment, I only have Instagram and Twitter, but hopefully I will soon have a Facebook account for this podcast as well. So you can find all of the links to my social media accounts in the show notes. And in the show notes, you will also be finding links to the sources that I have used in researching this very episode that you've just listened to. Thank you very much again. Maraming salamat and mabuhay.